All right, so welcome back to The Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And after receiving several emails, I have reached out to a good friend of mine, wonderful scholar, professor, a distinguished professor of German emeritus at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I have here Dr. Rolf Goebel. And today we have a kind of special treat. We're going to be discussing Adorno's aesthetics or his theory of aesthetics. Now, Dr. Goebel has been on this series before. We had a wonderful discussion on Holderlin. We've talked about Kafka. We've talked about Rilke. And I think it's great that one of your expertise is in aesthetic theory. So to have you here to discuss Adorno's aesthetics is just going to be wonderful. So why don't we start off with a bit of biographical details about Adorno and maybe his relation to aesthetics?
Yes, good evening, Chris. I'm glad to be back. Um, Let me just highlight a very few things in Adorno's biography. So he was born in 1903 in Frankfurt am Main. And I don't know if we can show this. I actually have a historic photograph of the promenade, the Main River promenade. And this is where Adorno was born, in one of these houses. So he was born in 1903. His full name is Theodor Ludwig Wiesengrund Adorno. So he is usually referred to as Theodor W. Adorno, Theodor W. Adorno. Um, Adorno was the maiden name of his mother, and he adopted that later on and added it to his family name, Wiesengrund. And like other intellectuals of his time, notably Walter Benjamin, Adorno belonged to the financially fairly well off, assimilated uh, Jewish descended families in Frankfurt. His father had converted to Protestantism, and his mother was of Corsican origins, hence Adorno. But Adorno himself was always sort of aware of his Jewish ancestry and cultural heritage. Although he was, of course, fully, secularized in his personal life. So anyway, he studied philosophy and musicology and psychology at the very noted Frankfurt University, the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt. And he got his doctorate with a work on the phenomenologist Edmund Husserl, um, and wrote his habilitation, the secondary thesis necessary in Germany to get an appointment as a professor at the university. He wrote the habilitation on Kierkegaard, on the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Um, and I mentioned, that he was always sort of working through and dealing with his Jewish descent, which became palpable when, like many, many other Jewish intellectuals, uh, the Venia Legendi, the permission to lecture at the university, was retracted by the Nazis in 1934. And this, again, like for Benjamin, initiated Adorno's life as an exile, he went to Oxford University, to Merton College, um, and in 1938, he uh, went to New York and became a member of the Institute for Social Research. Very importantly, in 1941, he moved from New York to Los Angeles, where he met many other, German exile artists, Thomas Mann, Schoenberg, and others, and then stayed in Los Angeles or in the area of Los Angeles until 1949, when he went back to Frankfurt and was appointed something like an affiliated professor at the University of Frankfurt again. Also joined the Institute for Social Research that had been sort of refounded by his great collaborator, Max Horkheimer, also in Frankfurt. Um, and emerged as one of the leading proponents of the Frankfurt School of Critical Research, again, together with Horkheimer and Marcuse and others. Um, and so he, had a very successful, if highly controversial, career as a professor at Frankfurt University. And in May 1968, the student rebellion broke out in Paris and in German cities, including Frankfurt. And Adorno found himself caught in those riots. Adorno sympathized with the students' attempt to address unaddressed questions of Germany's Nazi past. But Adorno did so from the perspective of political philosophy, not necessarily of political practice, whereas the students put primacy on political action, including occupying university buildings, interfering with Adorno's lectures, and so unsuccessfully negotiated that tension between political practice and political philosophy, to an extent that the students sort of disavowed Adorno as their potential philosophical guidance, um, charging him with betraying the political, politically opportune action. As I said, they disrupted his lectures, and Adorno, they occupied the Institute for Social Research. Adorno had to call the police, and there is this infamous scene where some female students rushed up to his podium, showed their bare breasts as a sign of protest. And Adorno was totally unfazed. He said, I've seen such a thing before. But this was sort of symbolic of the growing rift between student-sponsored action and Adorno's social philosophy. He suffered greatly from this tension, went on a vacation trip to Switzerland, where in 1969, so shortly afterwards, he died of a heart attack in Switzerland at the age of 65, 66.
But still such a an interesting life filled with both turmoil and great ideas. I myself am not so familiar with Adorno's work, so you'll be kind of not only navigating the viewer but navigating me as well too. So you have like a double task here. No pressure.
I
So
have a triple task because I also need to navigate and re-navigate my own journey through Adorno, but we'll do our best.
no, as in other episodes where I forgot to mention the Walter Benjamin episode, which was fantastic as well too. You do such a great job of bridging the gap between philosophy and literature or philosophy and art, and this is why I'm so excited to have you here. How about we now turn to the kind of core issue with his aesthetic theory? What is the importance of aesthetic theory in Adorno's own oeuvre, and maybe for the Frankfurt School? Is that too much of a big question, or is
Oh,
that
no, no, this really goes to the core of what he was. Um, as we briefly mentioned, Adorno is rightly known primarily as a social and political philosopher, being a member of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. And critical theory in this context means an analysis, a philosophical analysis of the historical origins and internal contradictions of modern technological capitalist consumer society. That's a deliberately big word that I concocted here, but I did so to at least sketch what critical theory tried to address. And Adorno's aesthetic theory that we will focus on here um, is part of that larger project of philosophically analyzing these social contradictions. Adorno, we need to add now, in addition to being one of the most important social philosophers of his time, was what I think is the most important philosopher of music of his time. And that is a big claim. And I got myself into trouble recently at a conference for claiming this, but I stand by this claim, especially because this status as a preeminent music philosopher um, informs his aesthetic theory and is extremely controversial and problematic. So, when I think that he was the most important music philosopher of his time, I think so because of, not because he was the undisputed leading music philosopher, but because of these internal contradictions. For example, his music philosophy, and I'm phasing this into the aesthetic theory in general, his music uh, philosophy was developed through an analysis of the musical material that sort of emerged with classical music, most prominently Beethoven, and then culminated for Adorno in the development of musical atonality and the so-called second Viennese school uh, of Schoenberg, Alban Berg, and Anton Webern. And Adorno was affiliated with that movement directly as a composer and as what I think was the leading, if again controversial, philosopher of that kind of development from classical tonality to atonality and 12-tone music. Now, this shows us that Adorno was very, very emphatically and deliberately uh, anchoring his music philosophy in Western classical music to an extent that he, in a very polemical and one-sided and ultimately untenable way, denigrated anything that he thought did not fit Western classical high music, most notably American jazz. He wrote on American jazz as what he thought a product of American consumer industry, which, of course, almost totally misses the historical and aesthetic achievements of American jazz. Adorno has been rightly criticized for this one-sided focus on Western classical music. But as I try to point out in, our Benjamin and Hölderlin and Rilke videos, I believe that if not the greatness, but the significance, the provocative significance of outstanding poets and philosophers does not necessarily lie in their sort of absolute truth, in their, you know, um, sovereign, presentation of irrefutable truths. But on the contrary, very often I think philosophers raise extremely important questions in a deliberately one-sided way and thus provoke questions, for example, those that we try to address tonight. Okay. Adorno's last incomplete book, he wrote two incomplete works, one on Beethoven, one on musical interpretation and musical technological reproduction, and the aesthetic theory, which was published as a very comprehensive but fragmentary exposition in 1970, so years after Adorno's death. For me, the aesthetic theory, especially recently after rereading it, um, sort of was one of these absolute shock experiences in my intellectual life. I began to study the aesthetic theory, goodness, 25 or so years ago, and thought, well, this is an important work. Um, but it did not sort of really affect my own philosophical and literary critical thinking until just a couple of months ago, when by chance I grabbed it again and began to read it very, very carefully in greatest possible details again. And it occurred to me that the aesthetic theory, despite or for its internal contradictions and one-sided claims and very often dogmatic, apodictic pronouncements, is really the most important aesthetic theory in a single volume of the 20th century. So maybe we can begin by addressing this work by talking about some of the influences that Adorno opened himself up. Would that be something that we could do?
Yeah, I was about to ask you about some of his aesthetic influences, actually. So you kind of anticipated my next question. So maybe we can now move to this idea of maybe his aesthetic influences. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And the influences on the aesthetic theory overlap with the influences that inform his social philosophy, most notably the famous negative dialectics. And we can name three figures: Hegel, Marx, and Freud. And we know that Adorno was not the only one who would cite those three figures as the foundation of their philosophers. Um, but what Adorno learned from Hegel was a dialectical thinking in opposites, but contra Hegel, Adorno was critical of Hegel's attempt to move from thesis to antithesis to a synthesis as the sort of engine that drove history, according to Hegel. And Adorno was skeptical of any synthesis, of any synthesizing thinking, fairly or not, associating it with questionable syntheses in politics, most likely or most notably authoritarian regimes. Now, this is one of Adorno's very questionable associations, and I have further, probably equally problematically, foreshortened that connection. But in any case, Adorno maintained that a dialectical thinking is very, very important to combat what he thought was sort of, facile, apodictic pronouncements of history, of art, and what have you, um, without arriving at a synthesis. Um, what he took from Marx was the idea that any cultural phenomena, art, for example, is not moving in an autonomous way, but is informed by social history. And we will have to fine tune that relation between art and history in a couple of minutes. But the idea that art is always already in highly mediated ways embedded in history and social politics, that was what he learned from Marx. Um, and Sigmund Freud was the third important influence because Adorno was very interested in the function of the subconscious or the unconscious, less so on an individual level, but on a collective level, on the level of society, to an extent that he tried to analyze anti-Semitism and authoritarian thinking as political social symptom of repressed desires, um, again, less so on the part of the individual, but on the collective. This, again, is a very abbreviated version, but it helps us, I think, to understand parts of the aesthetic theory.
I just had thank you for that. I just had a quick question for you. In my past life, I was quite I was quite obsessed with Deleuze, not so much anymore. But Deleuze seems to think that after World War II, especially in his cinema books, that art, especially in cinema and in music, needs this agitprop. It needs this shock element. And for him, he likes, you mentioned Berg, Deleuze loved Berg, he loved Boulez, Stockhausen. So how did Adorno deal with, let's say, the postmodern elements in art and in music? Because Deleuze sees it as a movement away from the traditional action, situation, and action to this kind of schism, this kind of break, this break in with World War II, with what happens there. We no longer believe in the world, he states. So how does Adorno and his theory of aesthetics deal with more of the postmodern? I know he doesn't like jazz, but how does he deal with these more postmodern elements in music and in art?
That's a very, very good question. And the quick answer is he didn't. That does not, at all, disqualify your excellent question. But Adorno is emphatically a classical modernist. And if we can, we'll return to your question about what Adorno may have to do with postmodernism at the end of our conversation, because there are connections, but only because Adorno um, was not yet, again, he died in 1969, a postmodernist. Um, but again, your question is very good because it allows us to focus on Adorno's classical modernism. So the aesthetic theory of 1970 is the most comprehensive attempt at that time to analyze aesthetic modernism as a critical interrogation of classical idealist aesthetics. Okay. And in that sense, it fits very well in hopefully into your series of German idealism. Um, and so what Adorno does in the aesthetic theory is he takes up key concepts of classical idealism and literally deconstructs them. In other words, he does not refute them, he does not discard them as anachronistic uh, thought, but he tries to do with those idealist notions what he calls immanent critique. And immanent means that as a philosopher of the Second Viennese School and abstract art and modernist literature, Kafka most prominently, Adorno takes modernist art, again, art here is Kunst, combining, literature and paintings and music and so on, art with a lowercase a, um, as the vantage point to internally interrogate classical concepts in such a way that he sort of breaks these concepts apart like sort of an overripe fruit and reveals certain potentials of classical aesthetics for not just modern art, but for modern society, for modern times in general. So this is the dialectic move, right? So he moves from, in this case, from antithesis, modernist art, back to its presumed thesis, classical idealist aesthetics, but um, does not stop, but works on an immanent dynamic critique of that constellation between classical idealist and classical modernist thought without trying to arrive at a synthesis of idealist thought and modernist art. Um, and we can talk about some of these categories that Adorno focuses on.
I was just about to talk to you about the interrogation of modernist art in light of classical idealism, which you did such a great job of speaking about immanent critique. But what about the dichotomy between autonomous art and social engagement.
Yeah, that is one of the key questions, um, which he addresses very early on and traces throughout the aesthetic theory. So Adorno assumes that art has a double character, as he calls it. He says art is at the same time a social fact. In fact, may not be the best term, but he uses that term. Uh, art is so social fact here is that art is partially embedded in the society to which it responds. Um, But the term fact is not a good term because Adorno insists that art reacts to society not by mimetically mirroring it, as, for example, realism did in the 19th century. But Adorno, on the contrary, argues that art's relationship to society is mediated by art's autonomy, by art's aesthetic autonomy. And art's autonomy status is something that really emerged not for the first time, but radically around 1800, around the time of classical German idealism. And again, aesthetic autonomy, as the term says, means for the thinkers around 1800 and for Adorno, means two interrelated things. On the one hand, art's autonomy is itself a social product because for composers like Beethoven, for writers like Hölderlin, um, arts autonomy emerged with the bourgeoisie's attempt to emancipate themselves from the bonds of the church, of court culture. And as the bourgeoisie emerged as what they at least hoped to be an autonomous social class, art followed that emancipatory impulse of the bourgeoisie and became again independent or largely independent or as independent as possible from representing uh, church doctrines or aristocratic court culture. And in so doing, art became also aesthetically autonomous, not just politically autonomous from social reality, but became autonomous aesthetically in a sense that all the details of the artwork referred primarily, not exclusively, but primarily to themselves, to each other. Anticipating, and hence again your great question of a while ago, anticipating indeed uh, Derrida's infinite play of signifiers um, without direct mimetic reference to the signified or social reality, right? So in this sense, Adorno tried to think together art's response to society while maintaining its aesthetic autonomy. And how did art do this? Adorno came up with an ingenious and very important, uh, not solution, but suggestion. He said, if art is aesthetically autonomous, if the details of the artwork basically or primarily refer to one another, then art does not directly mirror or describe reality, but art's internal contradictions, the endlessly dynamic and contradictory interplay of the immanent details of the artwork replicates the social and political contradictions of external reality. So art is not describing those social contradictions, but art is replicating social contradictions in aesthetic terms as internal contradictions of the artwork itself.
When you stated that, the first thing I thought of, and it caused such a storm in the art world, is Manet's picnic painting with two males, and I believe it's a prostitute. And this was scandalous to the point where I think Manet and others started their own. They started their own kind of, not a museum, but their own. You come and look at their work. They would display their work for a special audience. So that's really interesting. I thought of that immediately when you said that. So
Yes, and artistic secession movements where, an avant-garde art emancipates itself from what they consider sort of the established um, art forms, that is part of what Adorno would identify as this constant wrestling of art with its own autonomy. Its own autonomy, it's in the sense of emancipating itself from bourgeois reality, but also emancipating itself as secession movements from other more established forms of art.
thank you again. This um, I'm not very well versed in art history, but it's like a secret passion of mine, a hobby of mine. I love painting. I love art. So I'm always going to the Art Gallery of Ontario. I like posting images of art on social media. So I do like these things. I'm a little underdeveloped when it comes to knowing the theory, but when you bring up things, they really hit home. So I can't thank you enough for that.
It's nice, Chris, that you are mentioning a particular phenomenon in art, because it helps us to recognize what uh, I always feel in the aesthetic theory, that Adorno uses relatively few concrete examples. I mean, Adorno wrote wonderful essays on Beethoven and Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, on writers like Kafka and Robert Walser and Hölderlin, most notably. Hölderlin was one of the great uh, focal areas of Adorno. Adorno, as a footnote here, wrote what I, somewhat daringly, but I'll do it, consider the single most ever written article on Hölderlin. An article named Parataxis, where Adorno analyzes the middle and late Hölderlin's use of syntactic parataxis, um, the sort of montage-like juxtaposition of fragmented sentences as opposed to the classical hypotactical um, organicity of the classical artwork. Um, so it's good that you bring up particular examples because, again, Adorno's aesthetic theory gives an amazingly comprehensive analysis on what it claims to be and on an aesthetic level, right? It's called not just aesthetics, it's called ästhetische Theorie. So it is an attempt to theorize something in such a way that it, intentionally or not, but in a very problematic way, almost effaces the particular examples that Adorno had, of course, in mind, and that Adorno analyzed, as I said, in countless other essays, but not in the aesthetic theory.
As you bring up these points, I'm flooded with examples. One of my favorite examples is Caspar David Friedrich. Like
Mhm.
he's an artistic painter, but he is a romantic painter in the sense that he is situating his artwork against Enlightenment art, so or the Enlightenment understanding of mind and body. And now we have, humankind, you know, dwelling in nature. I'm thinking of that image, the painting of the human standing at the elements with water kind of splashing inward, being humans picnicking at dawn and dusk, almost the interplay of nature and humanity. So, or the human. So I can see it. I can see the kind of autonomous art and its relation to social engagement. So it's really, really hitting home, especially. And I haven't read Adorno, so what you're saying is really, really, is really, really interesting.
And we should tell our viewers that this is almost an improvised conversation. Uh, we outlined 6 or 7 categories that we may address, but it's really an improvised discussion, and it's so wonderful because as I listen to myself responding to your questions, I realize that I am still wrestling with the complexity of Adorno's thought. Um, if our viewers think that I am stuttering and working with incomplete sentences and repeating myself and sometimes offering arguments that hopefully make sense but may be somewhat incoherent, um, yes, this is a sign of how at least I still wrestle with the enormous complexity and the intellectual rigor and philosophical sort of depthlessness of Adorno's aesthetic theory. Um, So let me take up your example of Friedrich. Um, as I said, he is one of the most important painters of romantic nature. And Caspar David Friedrich uh, could serve as an example for another category that I'd like to bring up, the category of beautiful semblance, in German Schein. Um, and the German idealists used the term shine in a double way. Shine means, on the one hand, what its English cognate shine, Shine, means, like the sunshine, something that propels itself forward into the visible or audible or readable presence. But shine also is related to the German word scheinen, to appear, as opposed to being real. So Schein, Schein in German, the beautiful semblance is both something that has a real presence. It can be heard and seen and read, but as something that is by itself an illusion. Put differently, shine indicates that ability of the artwork to simultaneously appear to us as something that's readable, visible, and audible as an illusion. It's not, and in that sense, I am not happy with Adorno's term of art being a social fact. And he goes into great length arguing that art is not a fact, it is shine. But Adorno develops the notion of aesthetic shine by devoting many, many wonderful pages to the beautiful semblance of nature. And he argues that the Romantic painters, especially, turned natural beauty into an artistic image, into a material presence of natural beauty in the forms of the finished painting. And so, in that sense, Caspar David Friedrich illustrates several things. You are probably a better connoisseur of Friedrichs than I am, but I remember that I was always sort of, you know, gripped by the tension in Friedrich's paintings between a seemingly idyllic nature and then when you immerse yourself into his paintings, you realize that this is, again, a highly artistic scenario. You have these wanderers. Um, in one painting, at least, you see the wanderer with his back to the viewer, and he's contemplating a seemingly idyllic or even sublime landscape in such a way that you don't see what he sees. You don't see his face. You see the back of his head and his back. And I always wondered, is the wanderer um, marveling at the idyllic beauty of nature, or is he overwhelmed? Is he scared by the sublimity of nature? Well, we don't know, right? So I think Adorno would say, well, here you see that the artwork itself, this painting by Caspar David Friedrich, thematizes in its own contradictions. You see the viewer, the wanderer, but you don't see his face. The contradiction between the wanderer and what he contemplates, nature. You see nature up front, but what you're actually seeing is the tacit implied contradictions between the wanderer's perception of nature and nature itself.
They're beautifully put. There's also one of my favorite paintings. I recently posted it. It is it's a probably an adolescent. He's sitting with his leg like that in the ruins of a church. And that's the funny thing about it. It's the ruins of a church, a broken church, severed church. But the view, he's looking out the window, this broken window, and out there is this landscape. And you can see almost the tips of the trees on both sides of the painting. So, yes, absolutely.
And I'll look up that painting. But the way you describe it, this fits perfectly into Adorno's idea of shine that Adorno argues in classical aesthetics. For example, here, Caspar David Friedrich, you begin to see how shine reveals itself something that gives us the illusion of organic unity
Yep.
and harmony and reconciliation, but in such a way that even romantic art, idealist art, begins to show the breaks and the contradictions of that illusory unity. And Adorno said, in that sense, classical romantic art anticipates what fully unfolds in modernist art, the idea of montage. And he's thinking of avant-garde movements like surrealism, um, Dadaism, and other movements where the fragmented nature of reality explicitly returns in the fragments in the ruptures, in the ruinous details of avant-garde montage and collage. Um, and that's why Adorno would say, well, see, if you focus on a montage by the surrealists or the Dadaists, um, you see in full unfolding the contradictions and the ruptures that classical romantic art wants to sort of pamper over, but unsuccessfully to its classical romantic art's credit. Because Adorno would argue, see, you see that artists like Caspar David Friedrich are already aware that what art offers is an illusory harmony. Not in the sense that art offers a fake harmony. Art, classical romantic art, Adorno would never claim is sort of fakery. No, classical romantic art tries to hold on to an ideal of harmony and unity while recognizing that it's an ideal, that reality itself is so full of often catastrophic contradictions that those contradictions spill over into the autonomy of classical romantic poetry and art and music, most notably, which then again unfold in, let's say, musical atonality full of dissonances, in Anton Webern's highly fragmented, very short compositions, um, in Dadaist art and modernist poetry, uh, certain works by Rilke, for example, and others.
Well, thank you very much for that. This discussion is, I'm extremely excited and very, very happy to talk about all of these things. Because even though I don't know Adorno as well as you do, I can see how the theory is applied to specific artworks, and that's important for me at least. What about how does Adorno understand like a precondition of understanding or historical unfolding and meaning and truth and content? How does he see all of this in terms of his theory of aesthetics?
Yeah. So we talked about Adorno's idea that classical romantic art tries to grapple or begins to grapple with the idea that art is not something static, is not something that has an immanent harmony. Art is not something that arrives at a final or definitive representation of something conciliatory in the world, but that art around 1800 at the latest begins to break apart under its own attempt to wrestle with the possibility of harmony and autonomous unity. And Adorno says those contradictions of art manifest themselves in the internal dynamics of an artwork. So Adorno again tries to wrestle with the tension uh, between, on the one hand, a poem has a material solidity. Hölderlin talks about der feste Buchstabe, the solid letter, right? On the one hand, a poem is printed on the page as something that has a fixed presence. A painting depicts nature, but in a fixed material way by putting it on a canvas. Music is more complicated, but even music, Adorno goes into great details, is fixed in the musical score, in the printed notes. that then need to be realized in a temporally evanescent performance. So again, Adorno says, on the one hand, the materiality of art is solid. The printed letter, the painted colors, or the written down notes of a music. But within that material solidity, the individual elements, the notes on the page in their dissonant polyphony in a musical composition, the painting that, as you said, depicts simultaneously a ruined church and an idealized landscape outside. Here, Adorno says, you see that the seemingly solid elements of art are in constant contradictions. They move constantly around by themselves. And Adorno very boldly says it is not the perception of the viewer who finds those contradictions, but art itself. The materiality of art is my term now, not Adorno's, is sort of like a machine. Um, um, the engine of a car is at the same time has a material presence. The machine as such is the same whether my car is in my driveway or moving on the highway. But the internal parts of the self-identical machine are in constant motion against each other. The pistons are moving up and down and what have you. And so for Adorno, the work of art is, again, my term, not his term, is like a machine that has a self-presence in terms of its materiality, uh, based on the ever-changing internal immanent contradictions and movements against each other of the cogwheels and pistons and bells uh, within. And Adorno now, and this is for me, again, something that I didn't realize for many, many years, and recently dawned me, this is just something extremely provocative and bold and in a way transgressive. Not just, says Adorno, is the artwork internally moving, but that internal dynamics, that immanent dynamics, is the artwork's precondition for its own understandability through various periods of time. So Adorno helps us to see the enormous limitations of, for example, reader response theories, or what nowadays is promoted by otherwise very respected theoreticians of aesthetic experience, where the argument goes ultimately it is me as a reading subject, me as a reader, me as a listener, me as a viewer, who fills the materiality of the musical score, the painting, and the printed letter with meaning and significance and life. This is the standard subject-focused tendency of reader response theories, of postmodern emphases on Erlebnis, on lived experience. This is the predominant focus on art by cultural studies, where art quite legitimately becomes the site of my own position as a minority, as a post-colonial subject, as a queer artist, or what have you. These are very, very legitimate ways of finding meaning for myself in art, but Adorno provides a counterbalance, not a supplement, but a counterbalance to this subject-oriented aesthetics by saying no, primarily and ultimately, the meaning of the artwork does not arise from the subject, from the listener, the viewer, and reader, but meaning arises in ever-changing ways from the internal dynamics of all these details of the artwork. So to go back to my somewhat, lame and far-fetched analogy between art and the engine of a car, um, the engine promotes itself on the highway through its own internal dynamics, only because the car engine itself, um, uh, you know, has parts, the pistons and the belts and the cargo wheels that are moving by themselves. That is the reason why the engine and my car actually speeds on the highway. It is not primarily me as a driver. We assume, I am the subject, I get into the car, I turn the key, I ignite the engine, I step on the gas pedal, and here we go. Adorno would say that is not false. He is not against the subject, the driver, the viewer, the listener, and reader, but he said, look, without the self-moving parts of the engine, without the self-moving parts of the artwork, you as the car driver and reader and listener and viewer, you won't get onto your interpretive highway. You would be stuck in your carport. And this for me is one of these really daringly um, sort of, probing aspects of Adorno's aesthetic theory, away from the driver to the car engine, away from the primacy of the reader and viewer and listener to the immanent dynamics of the artwork.
I wanted to ask you something because I'm not so well versed in musical theory. When you were talking about this kind of inner dynamic of the parts of the artwork, I was thinking of Basquiat. This the I think the African painter, the African American painter who would sometimes paint on walls, and because he started as a graffiti artist, but his paintings would display, in some sense, the poverty of young African Americans by citing words like asbestos throughout the painting to show that they were living in apartments or anywhere in poverty-stricken areas that had asbestos. So does he mean this kind of internal dynamic of a painting? That was one of the examples I was thinking of that kind of broke the I was thinking of that.
Yes, I think so. Um, Again, Adorno very deliberately does not really go into great details. So when you bring up, questions like this or Caspar David Friedrich, we can only sort of speculate what Adorno would have responded or how we can use Adorno's theory. And so Adorno's theory is not a tool that we can simply grab to explain this composition, that painting, or this poem. But you're absolutely right that your example shows that, of course, any artist and any viewer, listener, reader um, has an investment in the artwork. Um, if I am a post-colonial, a post-colonial subject, and I'm dealing with an artwork by, let's say, an African Francophone writer, of course, I read this from my subject position as a colonial writer. Um, but Adorno would say your subject position, or my subject position as a post-colonial reader, is only actualized and activated by the internal post-colonial dynamic of the artwork, right? So subject position of the reader, viewer, listener, and the quasi-subject position of the internal dynamics of the artwork are again in ever-changing constellations. And Adorno would say, why was a poem by Hölderlin written in 1806 and it was largely, if not forgotten, but dormant until around 1900 when poets like Stefan George and others literally rediscovered Hölderlin as their own. Adorno would say this was sort of initiated by Adorno and his circle and his contemporaries, but they could only find those things that resonated with their own art because it took Hölderlin's internal dynamic, the internal dynamic of his radically innovative artwork. It took those artworks decades and decades of semi-dormancy until they all of a sudden exploded in the hands of George and others, right? And as your examples show, this works with pictorial art, this works with music. For example, Adorno is extremely good in linking late Beethoven, the late string quartets by Beethoven, to the atonality and 12-tone technique of the Second Viennese School, early 20th century. And he shows that Adorno shows that Beethoven's string quartet are so internally fragmented, sort of like a montage, that they were almost incomprehensible to Beethoven's contemporaries. The string quartet that was asked to perform these string quartets was the leading string quartet of his time, and these wonderful instrumentalists said, "This is technically unplayable. This can't be played." And the audience said, "This is just incomprehensible chaos." But if we listen to those string quartets through the dissonances and fragmented structures of, let's say, Anton Webern, the most radical of the Second Viennese School composers, then we see what Beethoven was up to. Beethoven's string quartets were literally out of their time, not timeless, but they were out of joint with their own times because they anticipated what only fully materialized around 1900, 1910 with atonality and the Second Viennese School.
So I think we've touched on the disappearance of interpreting the subject and the artwork. I think that's what we just discussed. How about we talk about, because we're at that hour and a half mark, how about we talk about Adorno's aesthetics today?
Yeah. Um, so we began by addressing the question, does Adorno anticipate postmodernism? Um, and my brief answer would be no, because we talked about that he's really centered on classical modernist art, but by not being postmodernism, he no, he does not anticipate. Um, Postmodernism can rediscover or can discover its own concerns in Adorno's aesthetic modernism. And briefly, some elements. Postmodernism is even more radically than Adorno interested in montage, in incongruous internal contradictions of art. Postmodernism is via Derrida and others interested in the internal dynamics of what Derrida calls the play of signifiers. Um, Postmodernism is also interested in sort of promoting an emancipatory freedom of the viewer, listener, reader. Um, Postmodernism is also interested in insisting that art, past art, contemporary art, always needs to be made relevant and significant for our time. And all of this resonates with Adorno. He did not anticipate this, but so the dynamic does not go from Adorno to the postmodernists. The dynamic goes from the postmodernisms of our time back to a rediscovery of their own concerns in Adorno if they choose to read Adorno, which is not always the case. But this is a possible connection between postmodernism and Adorno.
Returning to that element of fragments, right? Moving from postmodernism back to Adorno. Yeah. I want to thank you so much for this wonderful, rich discussion on Adorno's aesthetics that took us through, bits and pieces of his social theory. We talked definitely a lot about pieces of artwork, music, um, and you did a good job of illuminating the aesthetic theory. And I think our dialogue brought out a lot of great examples. So thank you so much again for, sharing your time and your wisdom with all of us on this series, or in this series, sorry.
And as always, I thank you, Chris, for maintaining the series and inviting me back. So yes, thank you very much. And I hope that our discussion, sparked some renewed interest in Adorno's aesthetic theory. Um, and again, I hope that our sort of improvisatory discussion sort of showed the open-endedness of Adorno. I mean, Adorno, and then I will let you conclude the interview. Adorno belongs to those philosophers who always says Adorno's main business is not to give definitive answers, but open-ended, fragmentary questions that lead to other questions and other questions. So, on that note, thanks again, Chris, for having me on your show.
No, thank you. And I think that's a beautiful way to end the episode. So again, this is me signing off, and thank you so much, Dr. Goebel.
Thank you.